Mike, you're not joining us up here? Are you kidding me? He's so much taller than you. There you go. And he's still taller than you.
Height I have.
Okay.
You say your chair is so much lower. Why is your chair so much lower? This one, it doesn't.
This chair's not good.
Oh, okay. Well, something.
I'm sitting on a phone book. There's no treats, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm going to call this meeting to order. Can everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So welcome to a special joint meeting of the BET and Board of Education. We have one item on the agenda this afternoon, the presentation and discussion of the Greenwich Public Schools Capital Project Operational Assessment performed by consultant team Blum Shapiro. We welcome members of the public, RTM, Town and Schools Administration. For those new to the topic, the Greenwich Public Schools engaged Blum Shapiro to evaluate their capital processes last fall. The Public Schools Administration agreed to expand Blum Shapiro's scope of work to address concerns raised by several BET members, and also agreed to have the BET education liaisons join the project advisory team. That team met several times over the fall and winter to advise on the study scope, initial interview parameters, and field questions regarding preliminary findings. On behalf of the BET, I recognize and thank BET education liaisons Leslie Moriarty and Deborah Hess for their involvement. Peter, would you like to say a few words before I turn the floor over to Blum Shapiro?
Yes, thank you. I also want to thank the Board of Ed staff for their willingness and openness in moving this project along. I know our team is very interested in digging into the recommendations and implementing the recommendations, and felt it was a good opportunity for us to hear more about those tonight and any additional direction needed by our boards.
Thank you. So this is a new practice for us, and so we'll see how it goes. I'm going to introduce you all to Mr. Ziplo, who will maybe give us a little description of his project team and walk us through their findings.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Not yet. Get closer, please.
It's Don back there.
How about now? No. How about now?
Why don't you hold the mic? If it's,
Is this better or no?
yeah.
Is it on?
It is on.
Is Don Conway back there?
Don? Can you hear me?
Yes, better.
Get rid of this. Thank you all for coming tonight and having a discussion with us. I guess first and foremost, this is a first. I was told this is a first of having both a joint group, the joint Board of Ed and BET coming together tonight, as well as I was asking about it in the past. When was the last time this occurred? And no one had any recollection that this occurred. So I want to say thank you. We're looking forward to a discussion. So the way I'd like to move forward is the following. Do all of you have a copy of the executive summary? If not, I have copies. Okay. You need one? Okay. We'll get you one. So what I wanted to do, now that I can walk around with a microphone, right? What I'd like to do is certainly go through the presentation, and then we will answer questions at the end. And what we'll do is Lindsay and I, and I'll introduce Lindsay in 1 minute, we will come to the table in front. I'm going to present here. It just gives me an opportunity to see the presentation. But we'll both come to the to the table over there with microphone and certainly answer questions that you have. It would be great if you could just be recognized by the appropriate board, if that works, so that we're all on the same page. Okay? So I guess by way of introduction, my name is Jeff Ziplo. I'm a partner within Bloom Shapiro. I've been working with municipalities and school districts for the better part of 25, probably going on 30 years right now. God bless you. Working with me is Lindsay Donato. Lindsay's a manager, and she and I work together on most of these projects. And so she has quite a bit of depth and breadth of experience. By way of introduction also from the Joint Project Committee, and this was a bit unique, we had a joint project team. The joint project team consisted of folks from the school district in particular, the superintendent, Ralph Mayo, Lori O'Donnell, Pat Marinan, hopefully I'm pronouncing everyone's name right. Roland Geiger joined us from the town side, Melinda Frame, internal auditor from the town side, and then we had Leslie Moriarty and Deborah Hess, BET members, join us as part of the project team. And then towards the end of the project, Dan Watson, Director of Facilities, joined us for a meeting. We had, I want to say it was either 3 or 4 meetings jointly together. We had good discussions. And so the one really positive thing that I really want to bring out is, I'm sure all of you read some of the findings and recommendations, but most importantly, we're trying to look forward, and we're looking at the future. There was no finger pointing. There was no heated debates or discussion. It was a great dialogue to say, all right, our current state is this, but what does our future state need to look like, and how can we get there? And hopefully you'll see a lot of that as we get into the presentation this evening, okay? So I'm just going to kick things off, and we will start project overview. So essentially what we did, we reviewed the operational processes, controls, budget and spending practices within Greenwich's school district related to capital projects. We went through and interviewed approximately 20 people. So a lot of the people that were part of the team, the project team, along with other people within the school district, as well as folks within the town we interviewed, to get a good idea of the current processes and key controls that exist as it relates to the capital projects. We performed, I'll call it a risk assessment of what controls were as it relates to budgets and how budget transfers worked. And we're going to get into some discussion about this concept called bundling. And I'm going to try to give you some examples of bundling so that we're all on the same page of what a bundle is and how it works. We reviewed some of the rules and actually Greenwich's charter and Board of Ed regulations associated with capital projects. And then, ultimately, one of the other things we did, and it's not on this list, but I did want to share it with you because we did spend quite a bit of time on it, was a financial analysis. So collectively, the team identified 11 projects that we went through in great detail to look at and evaluate. Those 11 projects formed 45 sub-projects, okay? So we looked at projects and contracts associated with those projects in quite a bit of detail. And I can thank Lindsay Donato for going through those 500-page contracts. I think there were 22 of them. And I think she got a little bug-eyed after reading all 22. So those were elements of the project. that we performed. And certainly when we get to the end of our presentation and more to the questions, we can certainly answer any other questions that you might have on that. So let's talk about some of the findings and recommendations. So a couple things. One of the things we found is that there are a number of challenges regarding how capital projects are initiated and how they get started, right? So one of the things we learned is that the capital projects essentially get initiated through the school district. They identify what their capital needs are, and I know I'm repeating, or you all have gone through this a number of times. And then they then take their list of capital projects, provide it to the town. The town then reviews it, submits it to the BET for review and approval. Changes get made, and then it gets provided to ultimately to the RTM for final approval. Once a project is approved, that's when things need to happen, and they need to happen relatively quickly. And there are some challenges in that happening quickly. Part of it is legal contracts can delay some of these projects. You have a very robust legal contract process, and I'm not criticizing it at all, but it does take a bit of time to move it through the process. One of the things that needs to happen, particularly when we're working at schools, depending on the project, but for the most part, I have a window of opportunity to get a project initiated and completed within roughly 8 weeks. Because if I can't get it initiated and completed within these 8 weeks, and that 8 weeks takes place at the end of the school year and over the summer, then there are more challenges that need to happen. Many times I can't work during the school day, I have to work after hours. And or I also there's some additional background checks that need to occur for any people that go onto school property. So if we're not in school, I don't have to worry about those challenges. When we are in school, we have to deal with those challenges and issues. So there's a real big push to try and get through a number of projects during this 8 weeks. Munis accounts. So Munis is your financial management system, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail about Munis and its capabilities. But one of the challenges that has been in the past is that the Munis budgets have not been set up or configured, if you will, until after the July 1st timeframe, which means that I cannot go out and assign, so it's kind of a double-edged sword here. I can't assign chart of account financial information to a contract because it doesn't exist yet. I can't put any purchase orders against a particular project because it doesn't live and breathe in Munis yet. So there's a delay in that happening. And then, certainly you've all heard about, some of the other tasks and activities that need to happen. In particular, some projects require planning and zoning approval or different types of approval through planning and zoning, and so we need to be considerate of that. So from a recommendations perspective, one of our recommendations is once the capital budget has been approved by the RTM, there is no reason why it cannot be put into Munis. Munis has the ability to create multiple years in the financial system. So I have the current year, and I can have the future year. So that's part of what Munis is. And we've had a conversation in particular with Roland that I believe the town felt or got some sense that they couldn't do that, and that's being certainly looked at. But one of our recommendations, which is relatively easy, is to get the capital budgets into Munis in a much quicker time frame. And as part of that, once it's in there, we can set up the appropriate project cost encumbrances in the May-June time frame instead of having to wait until July. I think in our report we identified that the budgets weren't set up in Munis until this past year, until I want to say mid-July sometime. So we can move that up. And again, what we're trying to do is make sure that we have that full 8 weeks when school ends and before it starts. We can get the contracts moving forward a little bit quicker now that we have the actual chart of account information. And then we can also move forward, the planning and zoning process. Okay? Next finding. So when we sat down and as I mentioned earlier, we met with Dan, with Lori, and pretty much everyone associated with the capital project process. And one of the things that we learned is that right now there is really no formalized process or standards that exist to track, govern, or monitor project activities. So we had hoped to see policies, procedures, protocol, manual that really describe what the process is, how it works, what the standards are. That does not exist. And in fact, the way things are tracked right now are in manual notebooks, Excel spreadsheets. There is no centralized database of information. There is nothing that tracks key activities and projects other than what's locked up into an Excel spreadsheet, but there's not consistency through all projects that they're set up that way, so there really aren't any governing standards that are in place. We found that there was limited documentation as it relates to projects. So typically, if you think about this, we wanted to come in, what we wanted to see was a binder for each capital project. And within that, we had hoped to see sub-projects, right? That was not in place. Now, I want to take a step back because we need to be fair in this overall discussion, right? There was a significant turnover fairly recently. So we had a team of people that are sitting before you right now on the school district side that inherited these problems, right? They didn't create them. They were doing their best to deal with it in a very uncomfortable setting and situation. They were very forthcoming with information when we met and sat down with them and discussed, what was going on. They came up with ideas of how to improve and what we could do better. So there wasn't any holdback. It was, look, we know that we need to do things better. We inherited, and these are my words, not theirs. They wouldn't say we inherited. But it was certainly obvious that to us that they were given these set of situations and they had to address it accordingly. So I do want to be fair to them that, they didn't create this problem, they just inherited it. So our recommendation is really to develop, a more formalized process with standard documents and overall governance. How does this all work? It should be documented and detailed. They need to, the school district needs to develop standard checklists to review milestones. These checklists will ensure that standards are applied appropriately across all projects. There was also, I mentioned earlier, there's no database, right? And just point of fact, in our discussion with Roland, one of the questions I asked Roland is, does the town have a database that the school district could potentially use, right? So that I'm a big, whether this is good or bad, I'm a big shared services type of person. I believe that, we're trying to serve the residents of this community. So if we have tools, in particular software tools, that we can utilize together or share in some way, that benefits everyone. And so I did ask Roland, does the town have any type of centralized software that could be used by the school district? And the answer was not really. There's I believe in Public Works, they do have a homegrown type of database. and you know, frankly, it's homegrown. So for me, it doesn't really meet the appropriate standards that one would think about. But in projects of the nature that you're tackling, we need to understand what tasks and activities need to be performed. We need to understand the impact and key milestones or critical path, if you will, of what these tasks and activities are. We also need to understand how different projects interact with others. Are there resource constraints? Do things need to be done in one project before another project can start? All of those types of things are kept right now up here. Okay? I was pointing to my head, by the way. So my point is we really need some software that can help track this information. We can keep key milestones. We can generate standards and create standard checklists. We can look at this from a milestones perspective and look at key dates. We can identify who owns what tasks, right? None of that exists right now, and we need to just make a change. So the other piece of this is creating the electronic binders. As part of the electronic binders, we're looking to see in one place contracts, transfer forms, and all other standard forms that should be part of an overall project. And I can get into more of the details later. And in the report, in the more detailed report that you have, we provided, you know, I'll say a series of 4 files, if you will, that talk about what kind of information should be tracked in these electronic binders. The other recommendation is on an annual basis, we thought it would be a good idea to have the internal auditor on the town side go over and audit some of these projects. And the purpose and goal of that is not the stick, it's the carrot. How well are we doing? What can we do to improve? And that will help identify and provide guidance and support to make changes for the future. We're not going to be perfect when we start, but by having that outside perspective, we can certainly get someone to provide some insight and input. Okay? Our next finding, and I think what I'm going to do is digress for 1 minute. Give me 1 second. So before we get into the next finding, I just wanted to talk a little bit about bundles and projects and everything else, and I created a separate document that's not part of your report because to be quite frank, as I was going through the report today, I said to myself, they're not going to understand bundles. And then when we sat down with the project committee, I was actually diagramming it up on the board in our room, and I said, you know what, let me put something up that may be more meaningful. So in Munis, you have what's known as a chart of account structure. This is the financial, how we're tracking information. And typically, you have different segments. So segment 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 represent information, elements, if you will, of that chart of account. It typically represents, and this is an example, this is not exactly how you're set up. You might have more segments, but segment 1 is typically the fund. Actually, in Munis, it has to be the fund. And then you get into segment 2 is the CAFR, which is how to summarize information. 3 is departments. 4 is location. And then 5, typically on the Board of Ed side, is typically function, okay? But when you take segment 1 through 5 and combine them together, right, there's a shortcut in Munis called an org code. So when you look at segments 1 through 5, let's say they add up to 20 characters, right, of different numbers. Well, your org code is a maximum of 8 characters that is a representation of segments 1 through 5. Does that make sense? And I do want to answer questions on this. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay. It's a hierarchy. So segment 1 is fund. So what fund is it coming from? What department is it being charged to? And then what location? So when we get into it, and we get into these things called bundles, the org code actually represents, if you think of it, a location. Yes, yes, yes. It's the school. It's a high school. It's a middle school. On the department side, well, on the town side, police would be a department. Fire would be a department. Facility would be a department.
And function, does that mean like roof?
No. Function is typically arts, math, right? It typically have something to do with the Board of Ed. Okay? Sorry.
Jeff, can I just ask members if they're going to ask a question, if they could use their microphones?
Not a problem. Object. Object is the expense or revenue type. Okay? So an expense would be maintenance expense. Okay? And then the project is a unique project number that is associated, that is created for, in this case, let's call it roofing. Okay? 2018 roofing. Right? So that's a project. So then we're going to spin it a little bit differently, and we're going to say, okay, I can, based on that structure, I can take a project, right, and have it associated with multiple locations. Okay? So the location where you see project, below project, I have org code. So org code could be the high school, the middle school, and elementary school, right? If those org codes is considered a bundle. So there's a project number for like a program, roofing, and then underneath that project, I have multiple locations, i.e. bundles. Does that make sense? Okay, it's a bundle. So a project can have one org and object code, or it can have, I think we saw one that had 8 different org object codes. Most of the time, there was one object code associated with the org code. Okay? And again, that object code explains the type of expense. Okay? Make sense? All right. Okay. So when the school district submits their capital budget, the capital budget projects, at that time we do not know what project number it is, and we don't know what that bundle looks like. Okay, I'm just putting it out there. And so when the school district, so the question was, what does it mean? So, I'm sorry, I don't mean to. So when the school district provides the capital budget information over to the municipality, right, they do so based on the individual capital projects. They're not grouped together. Well, I guess they are grouped together to some extent, right? But there's no, the actual project number that gets put into Munis. Yeah. We don't. Yep. What I meant to, yep. So let me just stop. We don't know the actual project number. So that's my point. I don't know the other. Can I ask a favor? Can we hold that until I get through everything, and then when we sit down, we can go through those questions? Yeah, I agree. So I'm going to go back to, sorry. No, I closed out my, my diagram. I just wanted to bring it up one more time just for clarification. So here's one of the positive things that gets done as part of the bundling process. We allocate, monies are approved through the capital budget process at the project level, meaning we allocate $1 million to the project, which is broken out by the sub-projects or the org codes that you see there, okay? So when I take all of those sub-projects or org code and add them together, they will add up to $1 million, okay? During the time that a project is ongoing, there's over and unders between the various projects, between the bundle. So what has within the org and objects? I'm sorry. Good. Yep. Within the org objects. So what happens is, and what the way things work today is, if the top org code is under budget by $50,000, right? I can transfer the money within that project to another org code. Okay? And the transfer occurs internally within the school district. I'm sorry? Within the bundle, within the project. Right? Within the project. It cannot, right, and does not, it cannot transfer outside of that project without other approval. Okay? And that other approval is BOE, BET, and I believe RTM. Okay? So is that clear? Does that make sense? Okay. The positive on a bundle, right, is that the school district can transfer dollars around between the sub-projects relatively easy, right? And that also is a challenge. And the challenge is we need to make sure that we're moving the monies, that we're documenting the movement of monies in a detailed way. Okay? And the reason that I bring that up, and now I'm going to go back to the presentation, if you will. Is right now the way the school district handles transfers, there is a formal document, right? We reviewed them as part of this process. There is sign-off. But the descriptions on these transfers are very limited, right? And I think I put it in here, you know, a description, for example, is if you look at bottom D, it says HVAC work in GPS. Well, you know, that's a piece of the information, but that also doesn't tell me if we're moving money from one org to another within a project, does that mean that the org that I'm moving money from is going to be short? There's no detail. There's no definition. There's nothing that performs any type of risk assessment of, yes, we're moving money, and yes, we're going to be short, or we're under budget. It'd be great if the document said, under budget by $50,000, this other sub-project needs the $50,000, and that's why we're moving the money, and it's because of X, Y, and Z. Again, more detail, something that's documented, that we can put our arms around and feel comfortable that we understand why and what the transfer is for, and that we have a good sense of the impact of the transfer, if any. Okay? And again, I want to just reiterate that the model that exists today does allow for the flexibility to transfer monies, and that really is important as we move forward. So I think we're good here. So the recommendations is that we need to do a better job of managing the bundles, i.e. the sub-projects. We need to provide more detail in how the monies are transferred, why the monies are transferred, impacts of the monies being transferred, and make sure that everyone's on the same page. We also, one of our recommendations is that if there's a significant transfer, and we can debate whether 20% in the report, it says 20%, whether that's the right number or not, but I guess our point is, I think if there is a transfer over a certain amount, that we want to get the superintendent to acknowledge it and be able to say, why are we doing this? Does this make sense? Okay?
So, Jeff, I've got a question about the bundles. Is it always the Board of Ed asking for the bundles, or is some of this happening as we push through the budget process to make it a little simpler on the town in terms of the management on the munis side?
I don't think it has nothing to do with the town. To be quite frank, one of the questions I asked Roland, he's not here, but I asked, how does the town handle this? Do they have bundles? And for the most part, they do not have bundles. They just have projects. The problem, right, is to date, there's been a lot of transfers, and we'll get into some of that, right? There have been a lot of transfers, and so the transfers to us identify a situation where we haven't developed an appropriate budget. I'm sorry?
Peter, let's let him respond. Go ahead.
So we didn't develop an appropriate budget. That's why we're transferring money, right? For the most part. And so if we changed the paradigm and we said we're getting rid of bundles, right, that would substantially change how we need to budget for projects, right? I want to be very clear about that because that's a really important issue, right? Because there's going to need to be a lot more contingency put into place as it relates to projects. And so I hope everyone understands that. And that's why I'm not recommending that we do away with bundles. I'm not recommending that. What I am recommending is that we need to do a much better job of the details that we are tracking and the reasons why, and up the ante a bit when we get above a certain dollar threshold or percentage threshold to make sure that the key management team, superintendent, and probably the Board of Ed, recognize and understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and the impact on other sub-projects. Fair? Okay. I think you get my point about the bundles. Item D, cumbersome to link contracts to projects. So we had identified as a team, we sat down as a project team and got a lot of input from both Leslie and Deborah as it relates to what projects we're going to look at, okay? Bloom Shapiro did not pick the projects. I would tell you that it was, for the most part, a combination of the team, but the BET board members certainly had a lot of input into the No. We sat down as a team. We had a spreadsheet with a list of all the projects. We originally picked, I think it was 11 or 12 sub-projects, okay? And it was done, Bloom Shapiro did not pick them. It was done with the combination of Lori and Deborah and the team, if you will. As we got into this, we realized that we were picking sub-projects of a bundle, and it was very difficult to try to look at contracts and transfers related to that. So we changed how we were looking at this. So we picked 11 projects, which was a total of 45 sub-projects to be able to look at and do our analysis, okay? And my point is that this was, it was not a pure random selection where we put it through a random number generator. And we picked projects because they had either elements of meaning to a group or there were some discussions about it. So I want to be very clear that we didn't write down the reasons, but they said, this one's interesting, let's see what we get. Correct. Yep.
Could I just add something? When we went through it, we were trying to get coverage by type of project. It was across 3 years. It was 16, 17, and 18, and across schools. And if you took the total budget of those 3 years, it was over $70 million. When you backed out the digital learning and the new lab, the new school, you actually had substantial coverage by these contracts. I mean, we had almost 50% that were reviewed based on what they looked at ultimately by how the process went. I think that's important so people know that you ended up having a significant amount of contracts that did in fact get reviewed. Not contracts, projects.
Yeah. So, so when we pulled or we asked for the contracts linking to those projects, and one of the challenges that we had is, getting the contract and linking it up to the various sub-projects, okay? Most of the time there was at least one org code on there, project org code, on the contract. But particularly when you get to on-call contracts, that changes the dynamics completely. And so trying to link some of these contracts to sub-projects was confusing, time-consuming. Again, where we're going with this is we need to do a better job of documenting. We need to provide detail as to how these contracts link up. We should have a document that provides, if anything is going to use that contract, we need to have a document that demonstrates and shows that. Okay? So the recommendation on D is we need to do a better job of describing and listing out those org numbers related to contracts. I'm moving on to E, the capital improvement plan. So we were provided, and the director of facilities provided us with, there's an Excel spreadsheet that identifies the capital projects for the next 15 years. It does list out all projects, and there's summaries. You can slice and dice that information relatively well. As part of our recommendation on that is we think that the school district should consider transitioning the capital improvement plan into, I'll call it a more centralized asset management system, so that we can do a better job of tracking. We can look at costs. We can track elements and ongoing maintenance. I got to be honest with you, and I'm going to bring up the touchy subject right now. The reason that we did this project is because of the JC roof, right? And I reviewed it just again today, one of the things we didn't know about that roof was it wasn't really slate, it was terracotta, right? So my point here is that asset list should provide us with some really good information about the buildings and the assets that we have, and provide what the truth is about all those assets. And it shouldn't be locked up in someone's head. It should be locked up in a centralized repository of information. We did provide some cost information on some of these technologies. The other thing too, and I'll put it out there, is that for the project management software and this asset management software, the town could benefit from this software as well. So I don't want you to think that we're just putting on blinders right now. No, I think it gives us the opportunity, right, to look at that future state, to take a look at and see where we can be together as a community and have a centralized repository. We can put security in so the town can't touch the school and vice versa, but at the end of the day, we're talking about the assets of Greenwich. So let's talk about Munis. So Munis, as I mentioned earlier, is your financial management system. And it became pretty clear to us that people are struggling with Munis and how Munis works. And again, I'm going to go back to a very simple concept. People came in that didn't have any experience with Munis, and there's no training, there's no the onboarding process was go at it, work and figure it out. And some of the things in Munis, this concept of an org, most financial systems don't have this concept of an org. An org is a really key component in Munis's chart of accounts system. Munis has a more robust project management, project accounting solution than what you're using right now. You have the module, right? You have the module. It's just you're scratching the surface as to what it can do. Okay? So from a recommendation perspective, there's a couple. One is that there needs to be training. Training should be provided by Munis. Get the vendor on site and have them spend a day or two with folks to understand the project module. Again, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we can do this as a team between the school and the town, right? Because I don't believe the town's any better, okay? The other piece of this, I'm sorry.
Just ask that one question on that. Can the BOE really do it with Munis without the town doing this additional training and taking on the additional responsibilities? Or is that going to sort of upset the apple cart because it's our unified system?
Yeah, so it is a unified system, but the school district does have access.
No, I know that, but
to do what they need to do, although I will tell you that in order to create those projects and the respective orgs and objects, the school district does not do that. That's done by the town.
Right.
But there are other elements of that software module that they could use.
He's recommended use
Thank you.
Right. The other piece of this is Munis has a very good online library of information. They have an online university that is free to everyone in the town, within the school district. It's probably one of the best kept secrets because when we spoke to folks on both the town and the school side, people were pretty much unaware of it. They can get free access. They get a user ID and password, and they can go on to a knowledge base that will give them documents galore. They can also go and take training courses online. So if they wanted to see a particular topic, they could go online and take it. Okay? This is not a sales pitch, by the way, for Munis. It's just you're paying for it right now. You might as well use it and take advantage of it. Item G, personnel resources associated with the oversight of capital projects do not meet the needs of the Greenwich Public Schools. So just so that we're all on the same page, currently the facility director oversees and manages custodial staff, maintenance staff, telephones, and capital projects. This includes 13 buildings and approximately 85 FTEs. There's only one internal project manager and one facilities technical assistant. So when we started the project, which is back in, God, it seems like eons ago, but I'm going to say November, December, there was no internal project manager, and there was an external outside consultant. As of the January, I believe it was the January timeframe, they made an offer to the outside consultant, and that individual accepted. And so Dan now has, one full-time FTE, and they have a facilities technical assistant. One of the problems that we saw is that not enough time is being spent monitoring and tracking projects. Not enough time is being spent tracking and linking up costs within Munis to the costs that they're processing, the purchases that they're processing. And Munis is keeping track of the information by a single object, right? That one expense object. They need to keep their expense information by a multitude of expense categories, and that's a challenge right now. They don't have enough time to do it. We're also, the facilities technical assistant, frankly, is managing phones, and so that's distracting that individual and taking away from her time to be doing some of the reconciliation work. So from a recommendations perspective, I think we need to explore, some options about additional resources. We can look at additional staff, or we can outsource and obtain resources to bring on someone from the outside, a third-party vendor, so that they can help manage some of these projects. We can have a discussion about that after.
In plain talk, are you saying that you think that the project manager and the new facilities manager by themselves are probably not enough personnel to do the task?
I don't think it's enough. You're welcome. And it's certainly not enough for what your capital project program is looking like for the future, right? So I'm not just looking today, right? I'm looking at the future and where you think and you want to be in the future. And we want to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success. And I just want to point that out. I think during that compressed time period, it's difficult for one person to actively track all of those projects. I think they need to be supplemented through an outside resource during that period. Yeah. Well, if you're telling me, I understand, but I think it depends on what your future capital projects look like. And to be quite frank, this is not, I need and want our facilities director to participate in this discussion. Not necessarily right now, but this is an important discussion because he has a lot more of the inside facts and knowledge of how things need to work. And in particular, we're talking about a lot more documentation that needs to occur. Because right now, there's very little. Okay. I think in the short term, I think we can supplement it for that bubble during the, yes. And then once we have those systems in place, we can then reassess and say, do we need, can we do this on our own or do we need more? Yeah. Yep. Item H, we talked a little bit about this, the turnover in leadership. I mentioned earlier the superintendent, facilities director, facilities department administrative professional, chief operating officer, all changed within a very short period of time. And, you know, as a result, a lot of the institutional knowledge was lost. And because we lacked the documentation, right, we didn't have what was in people's head. And I know they did as good a job as they could to try and recreate some of this, but you know, they're only as good as the information and discussions that they could have with other people, and it was very limited. My only point here is that they have started ongoing monthly meetings as a team to ensure that the capital projects are moving forward. I think the only thing that I want to add is we need to provide, or they need to develop, governance standards of how we're tracking reports, how we're going to, what kind of status reports we're going to have. We did provide a couple in the detailed report. There's a section in the way back that talks about some of the templates. We will be providing that to them electronically, right? They're Excel documents for the most part, or Word documents. When you move forward with a project management software solution or asset management solution, we might be able to take away some of those documents, but at least there's something that they can work with to provide an ongoing status and provide stronger governance as it relates to managing projects. Okay. So our financial evaluation, the list in front of you are the 11 projects that we went through. I mentioned earlier that these 11 projects were 45 individual sub-projects. So we went through them in quite a bit of detail. We reviewed transfers for any of these projects that exceeded 20% or greater. So we actually went through, we pulled information from Munis. So within Munis, we were able to get a report for each one of these projects. And that report identified whether a transfer occurred or not, right? And then we were able to just apply a 20% to say, okay, was it greater than that 20% threshold? And if so, we then went back to the school district, to both Pat and Lori, and said, hey, we need to see the transfers. In or, it didn't matter. 20% in or out, okay? No, within a project. Within a project. So it was within the bundle. Okay? And so we went through that in quite a bit of detail. This chart here shows you that there were a number of transfers that did occur. So When you look at the column that says transfer percentage, right, you'll get a sense of, there were some pretty significant transfers. The number of transfers on the side suggests that, that we were moving, if there were 2 transfers, that 207,000, I'm looking at item 1, 207,924, there were 2 transfers that if you added them up equaled that amount. Okay?
Where did that money go? Because that
They're
doesn't-
within, so they get these were all transferred within the bundle. So within those sub-projects.
So within the org code, there are other projects that you don't list here.
So that project number, that 16273,
Right.
that's your bundle,
Right,
and then the org code, Greenwich School.
right, but I only see 2 there. There were more than 2 in that one, because if I look at the transfer of 207, they don't mesh. Where did that money go?
There's other, we summed it up on one page. We can,
Okay.
we'll provide you, and I
Alright.
think the
I
report
just-
provides the details.
Mr. Zippo, I think you're only reflecting on this page transfers over a certain threshold amount. So you might have another transfer that was below the
You
threshold.
could, yes, yep, you could. Yeah. But here's my point on the transfers, right? We just wanted to give you an idea of what the transfers and dollar amounts are that were above and greater than the 20%. That was number 1. Number 2, we wanted to validate that there were transfer documents signed and approved for all of these transfers, right, above the 20%. So we were doing some control checking to make sure that the controls that they said were in place were in fact effectively in place.
I think you're also scanning it to see that the transfers and kind of what was expected to be performed in the project was in fact, for the most part, performed. That was also part of what you were looking at?
Yes, and I was going to get to that when I talked about the contracts and, yeah. So the other piece of what our evaluation was from a financial and assessment analysis was, did we see any things that caught our attention? Did we see that there's another room being built for the high school as part of a project that didn't fall in line with, the standard expenses that you would see? So if it was a roofing project, right, why are we purchasing technology? I'm using that just solely as an example. Why are we purchasing, hundreds of thousands of dollars in technology as part of a roofing project? You wouldn't get that typical sense. So we were doing some analysis. So Lindsay went through the contracts to take a look and see what were in the contracts. And then we actually went through the transactional detail to look at the vendors that were hitting those contracts just to make sure that it made sense. Okay? There was nothing through our sample size of those 11 projects or 45 sub-projects. There was nothing that we saw that was, anything that came close to, oh, this doesn't make any sense at all. So we reviewed it, we looked at it, and we said, looks okay. Same thing with the transfers. We did find, and I think we identified it, there was one transfer sheet that we couldn't get because it was an older transfer, and because of that, it was no longer available, number 1, correct? And then one of the transfers was done through an email, right? So we have the email, right? And it says everything that a transfer should say, or the old transfer would say, but I will tell you it's not the actual transfer sheet, okay? Other than that, everything else was, we had and received all the transfers, there were sign-offs, and Lindsay, was there anything else that you can, okay.
Of the capital project process, the design and estimating?
No.
out of that, that's just like a process step that happens beforehand.
Correct, correct, yes. So I mentioned some of the findings, inconsistencies were identified, you know, and again, I don't want to, this is not a huge issue. We already shared with you the explanation of the transfer requests was very limited. They just weren't detailed enough. You didn't get a good sense of, you know, you got a little bit of sense of why the transfer, but you didn't understand, is there an impact, and do we need to be thinking about dollars for where the money came from? Yes.
So this is a related question to Peter's. So on these 11 projects, did you have any that were specifically for A&E? There would be projects that would be the initial part of a project, the A&E part, architectural and engineering. It's only the A&E for many projects or whatever it was.
Several of the contracts we looked at were A&E.
She's asking a question that says, let's take your project and object. She's suggesting that there's.
I'm asking a question, I'm not suggesting.
Project, there's actually two projects in units, is what she's saying. She's saying there was one that had to be set up as a cost center, which is called Project and Cost Center.
Ms. Moriarty?
Yeah. One of the projects, 17159, was the Advanced A&E account code. And if you look at
I'm
the...
sorry, I didn't hear what you said, 17?
17159 was one of the projects identified. It's Advanced A&E, and it's listed in the appendix that talks about the scope. Yeah. It doesn't really have transfer dollars associated. It's not transferred to individual projects, so that's why it's not picked up in this summary analysis.
The question is, if you set it up as a pot of money, and then they go do individual A&Es for, this one's for a future project, that one's a future project, is it set up under that project where each slice of that gets used is a separate object code?
No, that gets back to Jeff's initial point that they have a very simplistic approach with one account.
Yeah,
The future systems
right,
can
we
address
need to
that.
provide- we need to do things in more detail, right?
Thank you for your response.
But to build on Leslie's question, if you did it that way, you had spending across projects, could you go back and then report and say, tell me the full cost of this thing we did, regardless of the fact that it cost project?
Are you asking, can you do it in
Let's do the roof at
JC?
Right? Presumably they went out and did advanced A&E, and that was in a project code. Okay, and they said, we gotta spend, I don't know, $20,000 getting a roofer to come in here and estimate this. They come back and they say, I spent that $20,000, they come back and say, to replace this roof, it's gonna cost $1 million. Okay?
1.1.
1.1, fair enough. It takes 1.1. Eventually, we're gonna say, okay, fine, we gotta put in a project for $1.1 million to fix the roof. Now we gotta go do the project, right? Let's presume it all comes in on time, on budget, it matches perfect. Our true cost of doing that project was $1.12 million.
Yep.
After you go do all this, will you be able to run reports that say, if I wanna take the view of a full cost of doing the project, regardless of it's scattered across munis and codes, I can actually period that way?
So there is a way to do it. You'd have to keep it within the project. So if you kept it within the project, right, I'd take it, what I would do is I would keep it within the project, and I would have multiple object codes for the org code. And that way, the object code would be design. Yeah, you'd see the whole thing. And then I could look at it by org and project. So location and project, right?
Mr. Ziplo, can I just ask to you to clarify, is that would that be part defining what gets included in the definition of an object or a project, part of the governance approach, so that they can have a discussion of whether they want to keep A&E separate or as part of a project. So that would be a future discussion.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And Munis will handle it. There's no issues with it. The way things have worked in the past is the school district tells the town, what the org is and what the object is. If the school district said, we want an org that has 15 objects, they would execute on that. Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah. All right, I'm moving on. Contract evaluation, we talked about that. Implementation, so, and I apologize for the time, but I do appreciate us having some time to go through this. We put together an implementation plan. We tried to highlight those areas that need to be done first. Clearly, based on our conversation and certainly through, hopefully through my emphasizing certain key aspects of this project, we really do need to develop and formalize a process for tracking and monitoring projects. That's got to be first and foremost. We need to create those standards. And those standards really need to be in place before we can engage outside people to provide any type of ancillary services, project management support, because we need to provide them with guidelines of how and what information needs to be tracked for every single project, right? That's what we're asking them to work for us to some extent, and we need to provide the guidelines and guidance for what the rules of engagement are. And those standards are key and important to all of this. So you can see developing the standard checklists, the policies and procedures, creating that electronic binder. That needs to be done and started today, right? That's not a can wait moment. Implementing the project management software, we looked at that as a researching, and we provided a couple of suggestions and thoughts in the report. But researching and evaluating the software would be 6 to 12 months out. Installing and configuring and training, I would certainly recommend a cloud solution. And I'm going to go one step further. This discussion needs to be in conjunction with the town. I think you need to have your policies, procedures, and standard governance in place and understand, you need to understand what you want. And then, again, these time frames, let's not forget something. If we said start today, they're working on stuff so that it can be completed and in place for this, June, July, August time frame. And so we try to be a bit conservative in the spreading out of these tasks. If they can do it sooner, they can. But I didn't want to set anyone up for failure and say, oh, you can do this in 2 weeks. Well, there's other work that needs to be done and other priorities, I'm sure, that are in place.
Can I just ask another question? I mean, you mentioned that this should be done in conjunction with the town, but we haven't done any type of formal audit of their processes, if they do exist. I don't know. The town hasn't been involved in these discussions, so I don't really understand how that could happen without having the steps that we've already done.
Tracking of a project in general is something, there are some standards that are out there. If you go to the PMI, Project Management Institute, there's some standards that are out there that everyone should be following, right? I imagine, and you are correct, I did not speak with, a large number of people on the town, okay? But I would imagine that they would be interested in a similar type of approach. True. No, I agree. Item 3 is track and maintain additional project information. So this goes back to the types of documents and the level of detail that we want to be able to track. We talked a lot about the transfers. We need to provide a better transfer, more detailed process. Yes?
Jeff, can you explain dark blue versus light blue? What does your dark blue mean in this context? Just so. So it's not a higher, it's not a higher priority from your standpoint?
No, it's a. All right, it's a bundle, yeah. It's, the stuff underneath is really just suggesting more of, when it should occur. And the dark blue is, it's going to take this total amount of time. There's nothing magical about that, by the way. Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Yes, when you were looking at this, were you also looking at this in conjunction with purchasing and the coordination of the BOE purchasing, and whether the standards were similar with, the overall town's policies and so forth?
Yeah, there is a standard purchasing. Matter of fact, there's a binder sitting over there that is a very robust purchasing document. Yeah.
So you did review
Oh, yes.
all of this in conjunction with the town's purchasing manual?
Yes.
Thank you.
So then I was talking about item 3, tracking, maintaining additional project information, which goes along with what we had talked about earlier. Creating that and correlating the vendor contracts to projects would be item 4. The asset management system, we pushed that out. And again, these are recommendations. We just didn't feel that that was as high a priority as the project management solution. Item 6, provide comprehensive munis training. That can be done immediately, and we think it should be done fairly soon. The outsourcing we talked about, and then to be honest with you, I looked at 8. 8 is really goes across the board. It's something that's being done right now, so it really should reflect. And in this graph, actually, I think in the report, it does demonstrate it's going from now until the end of time, so to speak. So I'm going to call a timeout here because I'm done with the formal presentation, if you don't mind. And I thought that we could join you face to face if it's okay with you, and we could certainly answer questions. Is that okay? Okay, I am, yep.
So we want to thank you for your work and the presentation, and I think in order to try to keep an orderly progression, maybe we'll go alternating left and right. How do you think? It's hard to know. I'm actually going to take chair's prerogative and ask the first question, if you don't mind. And I was hoping that maybe if you could just quickly walk through the implementation plan tasks that you laid out and identify which entity, to the extent that it sits solely with one versus the town, is better suited to be accountable for starting the process. I think that you have a lot of great data and recommendations, and I think we want to digest it all, but we also need to know how do we move forward from here.
Can you all hear? Can you? Okay. So again, I think, the item 1, developing those standard protocols, the policies, procedures, and protocols and governance standards is of the top priority. This can be done in a couple different ways. You can task the board of, the facilities director and his team to put it together, and/or you can get outside support and help to help develop this. In other words, it would be a team effort if you did it that way, and you'll see there's some dollars associated with it, and that's the reason for the dollars. If you were to get an outside group to come in to work with Dan, the facilities director, and his team to help drive it, to help develop the documentation, policies, procedures, and protocols, with the understanding that Dan would first review, sign off, and approve, and then I suspect there would be other folks within the school district, and then ultimately I think it should be reviewed and evaluated by the Board of Ed, and just make sure that there's consistency and it makes sense, and they can certainly have input into what it is they're going to do and how they're going to do it. Equally important as part of that process is project status. I mean, Lori and I spoke a number of times about what's the best way to document a project status. And to be quite frank, right now, I don't believe it's being done in a way that is meaningful, that it will be impactful to say, we are at risk on this project or this sub-project, and here's why. One of the other discussions we had is, what about, how are we handling emergency projects? So there's a recent emergency project that recently came up where there was there was flooding in one of the schools, I believe, and water damage. And how what I'm trying to get to is what are the policies and procedures around it, right? No one's asking for a blank check, but what we are looking for is, how are we going to handle those types of situations? I bring that only as an example, not meant in a negative or in a negative way, but we need to understand how and I say we as a team, so it's the school district along with the Board of Ed, along with the BET, and ultimately the RTM, what are the rules that we want to follow, and how are we going to handle these types of situations? Each incident or event is somewhat unique, but I think there are standard protocols that we could put in place so that we follow a standard process and approach. And if we need additional information, additional monies, right? There is some protocol, but we should we should document it and provide a mechanism to follow it. And that does not exist today.
Ms. Dayton.
The wording of number 8 is very obscure. Almost everyone in the room here is in leadership. So what does it mean, establish ongoing meetings for the new leadership team?
So maybe it's a bad choice of words. It's the new leadership team within the school district that has been working together to date, meaning we called it a new leadership team because they're relatively new to the organization. We should change it. Bad wording.
So the administration.
It's the current administration. They are having meetings. I do want to say that. They do have monthly meetings right now. I think we need to formalize it, right? Meaning, I would like to see meeting minutes come out of it. I'd like to see formal documents that are provided to everyone. Again, it goes back to what does a project status look like? And I don't think those are well defined right now.
Thank you.
Mr. Turner.
You get that opportunity once in a lifetime, this is yours.
Thank you. In number 1, you say develop and formalize a process for project tracking and monitoring. What happens after a project is finished, and how are we tracking that? And if there's reporting requirements, for example, if there are reimbursements to be had, did you go through that? And why isn't that part of the scope of this?
It is. There is, and we talk about how projects, there needs to be a process of how we're closing projects. There isn't one right now. Yes, yes. I think it says completion in, if you look at develop standard for project creation change. Sorry. No, but closing projects is very important. What are the policies, procedures, and protocols that we're going to follow? And when do we close out a project?
Ms. Hess.
So sort of jumping on what you said, Jill, to start with, kind of where do we go from here? And if you sort of think about, there's 3 things, right? There's the whole process and procedures. And I think one thing that's important for the Board of Ed, we spend a lot of time on, is bundling. And how are we going to bundle? Are we going to continue to bundle? And what does that look like? Because I think that's going to be really important to this process. Then you've got call it your project management, right? Which, again, very important, because if you've got the processes, then you've got a systemized way to actually manage it. It's just going to make everybody's life easier. You kind of pushed out asset management a little bit, but I actually think that's very important. I mean, we've got a $750 million master plan, and it's being managed also right now by on an Excel spreadsheet. And I think that we need to know by school, by asset, everything that's in there, and we should bake in both the master plan as well as the maintenance. So we kind of know that the last time we did an HVAC, and it's a 15-year life, and we know that going out. So I actually also think the asset management element of this is critically important, because I think you need all of this together to be able to adequately kind of manage this capital. So I know you, anyway.
So I don't disagree. I am concerned about the resources that you have and their ability to do their ongoing daily jobs and their ability to take on, as you know, a brand new asset management system, because there's a tremendous amount of work that would need to occur for that to happen. I am not opposed to it in any way, shape, or form. We just need the resources and the time to make it happen.
Yeah, I'll stop for now.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just a few questions, either to Jeff or Lindsay. What differences do you see, if any, in the recommended job description of the project manager that's in the chart on the screen versus the job description of the project manager that just started last month, if any?
I would say very similar. I think that, again, as we need to spend more time documenting and managing a project, monitoring and tracking, and it's a project manager to do that.
Oh, okay.
Can I ask a favor?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
So just to confirm, is it identical? Is it wait and see? Is it?
I think it's similar to. I would like to certainly take advantage of the facilities director to provide some insight as to the person that he has, his strengths and weaknesses, and then based on the identification of any weaknesses that person have, we could find another person that has those in strengths. So,
okay.
There's another resource that has some good project management experience to help with not only projects, the upkeep and maintenance of tracking, monitoring. There's a number of I'm going to get into this, but there are a number of projects out there that haven't been closed. They're waiting to be closed. But where are the priorities? Closing a project or tracking, monitoring, a new one? So it's that resource to bring together a group of people that can do a better job of just the monitoring and tracking.
That leads to my next question. When I look at number 2, implement the project management software, track and maintain, and then the asset management software, who do you see as being the users of that? Is it a single PM? Is it both PMs? One, obviously you're recommending one, we have one staff now. Can you give some light to that?
Yeah, so I think there's a short and long-term answer to that. Certainly the short-term answer is internal people, so that we can track, key tasks and activities, dates and owners, resources and owners of those tasks and activities. I can also see providing access to vendors. So, the construction companies, they may need, and that's the more midterm to long-term approach, is maybe we should be using one system out there that we're tracking everything on, both internal people as well as external contractors.
Okay.
Well, they would have limited controls and permissions and restrictions based on who they are and what work they're doing, and it's not a free-for-all where vendors have access to all the projects and things like
okay.
that.
But my point is, thank you.
Yes.
But my point is that now I'm stealing this. But my point is that what we're trying to do is create a central repository of information that is up to date and accurate.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chairman.
Just to follow up on that, is there also a reporting aspect to that? It's not just the users of the system. At the end of the day, there's going to be accountability.
Absolutely.
So being able to actually export out, okay, these are the projects, this is where they are, and identify issues.
Absolutely. And so you can, many of these systems, you can keep track of risks, critical path method of what the duration of particular tasks and activities that are taking too long or either over budget or taking too long. And so the reporting component of this will be, should be exceptional to help validate the status of a project.
Well, maybe that's the agenda topic for the monthly meeting, is starting with the reporting.
Sure.
Mr. Mason.
So let's see if we can look at it a little differently. So Town of Greenwich, Board of Ed, capital projects. We have 6 different kinds. We have the idea that's a concept, we're going to build something somewhere and it could be 10 years out. There's the routine, painting, carpeting, doors, window. There's the replacement time life, air conditioning, boilers, mechanicals. There's some projects that actually have another whole set of steps before them in land use, municipal improvement, those delays. We have the building committee, the ones that we're going to do any kind of reimbursement that gets actually taken out of the Town of Greenwich, DPW, or the Board of Ed, Building Maintenance Division, to get handed over to a building committee. And I would say on that, we've tried several different models over the last 15 years. The one that we have right now and one of the projects we have running is, in my opinion, been the most successful. And then there's the emergency capital project like you're talking about. So that's our scope of capital projects. Then the hurdles. So the hurdles that we run into in town, and all working towards what's the next step. There's always logistics, and whether it's roads with closing roads and bridges, whether it's moving students from a location that's flooded to another location. There's delays, obviously, for different reasons. There's land use issues, environmental issues. We've had our fair share of projects get slowed down with that. And then there's always that last little important piece about the fiscal planning side of it, of prioritizing from a financing it point of view, or tax base, or whatever you want to call it. So that still leads me to what is the next question. I would thought we had a chicken egg question, but now I'm worried about how we find the farm before we get to the chicken and the egg. What we're looking this week at making decisions on millions of dollars of capital projects. Is it, I heard you say in your presentation you thought of a short-term remedy. To give an example, is that to bring in a professional construction management team and for the short time, right? Hand them off a series of projects, let them own them, report back to whether it's DPW or Board of Ed, and let them own those at the time while the Board of Ed gets to, and the town, by the way, because I'm pretty sure, judging what we're going to probably try to do a unified system, while we start attacking that. Because everybody's going to walk out of here and say, okay, we've defined the symptoms, what's the cure? And would that be your recommendation? Because I cannot see tomorrow in a meeting, finance board members say, well, we have to postpone all the capital for, I can't see that. That won't sell.
I'm not recommending that.
Right. So, again, my thought would be to take a certain amount of projects and hand the ownership of those over to a third party, let them own them, contractor at risk kind of thing, engineering, design, whatever the project happens to need.
Correct.
Obviously, DPW and Board of Ed are going to manage those while we start going down the road of something like this.
Correct. What you just stated, I agree, concur.
And I don't even work for them.
Yeah. All right, so we have a follow-up from Ms. Moriarty, although maybe you could clarify that was not part of the scope of your recommendations, right? That was something, did I miss that in your, you can, okay.
But, so I just want to clarify, because again, we are looking at their capital plan right now and looking at making decisions on capital. And just to make sure that Mike and I heard the same thing, the ownership of the project, it's still a Board of Ed project.
Correct.
So, and it's still a Board of Ed building, and it has to be integrated with everything else that's going on in a building. We're looking at the execution of the project as maybe instead of being handled internally, although I believe the Board of Ed has used construction managers to complete their work. So it's a continuation of that, potentially a different structure with a construction manager at risk versus a straight pay. I don't know if that's an important designation at the moment, but we can move forward on that basis while these processes and checklists and expectations need to be developed in the short term, but you can't just, you're not stopping everything while you're developing that. And we're still executing the fiscal 19 capital plan. There's still things out there that need to be worked on. So clearly there's a lot into the details, and but I want to make sure that we heard the same thing.
I heard what I heard.
Well, did you hear how I just restated it, or no?
Well, you're trying to change the answer. I heard what I heard.
Well, I don't think that's true.
So let me just be very direct about this. I did not say hold everything, you cannot move forward. I did not say that. What I said is that we need to create some standards and put those in place. But as we're running in parallel, I think we're going to need to obtain outside resources to help monitor these projects. As we develop our protocols and standards, we're going to get those integrated into these ongoing projects that have already started, right?
But just to be clear, Mr. Mason, I think you were thinking about it, that we're going to approve next week's HVAC projects, whatever they are, and I should remember them by now, but I don't. And designate those. Your intent is to designate those, turn it over to company X, and execute this for whatever dollars we appropriate, and that's sort of independent of management control of the Board of Ed. Is that how you were thinking about it?
At this point, I'll give you any answer you want me to give you. I think what we're saying here is that we can't.
Sorry, the town needs to, whether it's town or Board of Ed on these various projects, we need to bring in, call it a third party, hand them these projects to handle while we're working on this. As this gets in line, then we're back to managing our projects.
I think we're blurring the lines here. And let me just be very succinct about this, right? Two things. One, I think that we'll use the HVAC projects that are coming up? Or what projects were you just referring to? I apologize. I'm sorry. Sorry. So I guess my point is we can sit down with the facilities director, and with the approved projects, we can identify which ones make sense to do internally and manage internally, and which ones we should reach out to third-party vendors to help and assist with overseeing the project. That's what I'm saying.
We're going to go in order. Mr. Bernstein, Chair's prerogative goes next.
So if I heard you right, though, that's just one piece, right? We could also hire contract project managers to help close out existing projects. We could hire a consultant to help us with the implementation of this, right? So there's multiple models here. You're not advocating one or the other. But at the same time, work is not going to stop. We're going to keep moving forward on the projects that we have on the table. And the idea is to implement and I understand the point, is to formalize our process first and foremost, because without that, basically buying a system is useless, right? Okay.
Correct. And I'm not saying that we take away projects from the Board of Ed. That is not what I am suggesting.
Thank you.
Mr. Raymer, did you still have a comment?
No, I'm good.
Okay, Ms. Tarkington, did you still have a comment?
Yes, I wanted to just ask another question, please. When you looked at this, did you look at the law? You know, we're a very flat organization. As you can see, you're looking across a group of 20 elected people, and it's or 19 plus one. And so, you know, we're used to operating with this very flat organization. So when you looked at these projects, or you know, sort of follow on from my previous one, were they all, we'll call it the usual Board of Education projects, which I will call primarily maintenance, even though it's construction for maintenance? Or did you incorporate any of the separate large construction projects that are managed for the BOE by these building committees? And at the moment, we still have 4 of them. So, I mean, that's just sort of, that aren't closed out. And so the question is, as we move ahead, and maybe this wasn't in the scope of this, are we going to have to change these organizations? Because, you know, some of the software and some of the things you're talking about, you know, I'm a little bit familiar with. But when you're sort of incorporating this across this whole spectrum, and I'm only talking about the BOE, I begin to get concerned about the execution of it, although I highly support all of it. But how are you going to train? I mean, as an example, none of the chairmen of these building committees are sitting at this table or listening in the audience. So this is part of our problem, in my opinion, with the town of Greenwich, is this massive communication that needs to sort of be shared amongst all of us. We are leaders and decision makers, but not necessarily the people that will implement. How do we also incorporate these very important things to make sure that they're going to be universally implemented? And then also, you know, as a follow-on, just from recent experience, how everything they're doing, including, you know, we'll call it warranties, you know, so that it comes back. So even if they're being handled by these independent groups, how does this all get incorporated back into the system? And I assume it will incorporate those kind of things for tracking when warranties expire and so forth and so on.
That's part of that electronic binder that we talked about and referred to in the document. Going back to your original question about the major construction projects, off the top of my head, I think we specifically did not pick any of those projects to review. So to be honest with you, I can't comment on those because we didn't look at any of them and we did not participate in any meetings with them. I think, again, we can do a good job of creating some really good standards and then have discussions with some of the big project groups to say, here's some of our standards, you may want to consider them. I'm not sure there's a mandate that can take place because of those types of project committees, but I think, you know, what we're really talking about here is best business practices as it relates to project management. And there's it's well documented, right? We're not creating from scratch. There's a lot of really, really good information out there. So I think we can use that to, again, raise the bar. And it's not going to be perfect. So the year after, we raise it again, and we keep on looking at and evaluating how we can do things better.
So I'm calling on people based on when I saw them, giving priority to people who have not, in this discussion, not during the presentation discussion, spoken yet, which brings me, Ms. Crumick, you were first. Did you still have a comment?
No.
No, Ms. Stowe?
Yes. Hi. Does this move? No.
No, it doesn't move.
Gosh.
It's like this.
Ours move. Okay. Unbelievable. This is something we should focus on in our capital projects. First of all, thank you. This was a very well done, thorough report. And you're sitting in the hot seat and you've been taking a lot of questions, so thank you so much. And also speaking, I'm on the Board of Ed, so I'm gonna turn to our guys for a second. Speaking with Lori and Dan ahead of the meeting, they were very impressed with this report and also very excited about implementing a lot of these things. So just for a second to point them out, and hopefully they're gonna have a chance to talk. I don't know if that's part of the plan, but 2 questions, if you don't mind. You seem to be an expert in dealing with school systems and in governments. How often do you see the bundling mechanism? Is this like a 50-50 thing?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for you.
Okay, just you could think about it, or maybe do some.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
You're a little bit unique in the way you handle it, because what I've seen in the past is that you have an org and you'll have multiple objects, so you're tracking the expenses in a bit more detail within Munis.
Okay.
And there's less of the bundling component. Having said that, I do understand why you're bundling. And the ability to transfer monies makes things much easier and gives some fluidity to making, and again, meeting the timeframes that you're trying to meet, right? So I understand it, and I'll be very upfront to this entire group. When I first heard of it, I said, no, and I was going to say I'm pulling my hair out of my head, but that but I was like, no, bad practice.
Right.
However, after sitting down and having a discussion and literally walking through it and then talking about what impact it would have, I think bundling is okay, right?
Yep.
But I think we need to put stronger standards in place and better details for tracking the bundling. Because ultimately, and I'm a very direct person, so I hope you don't mind.
Right.
Ultimately, one has to ask the question, if we're taking from sub-project A and we're moving it to project B, what's the impact to A?
Yeah.
And are we going to be asking for more monies on project A in the next year?
Right.
I mean, let's be honest. That's really what it comes down to.
Absolutely.
So we need to understand what that is and the impact on those transfers. And we need to be very deliberate about it and transparent. This cannot be held within that group there. This needs to be disseminated within the Board of Ed, right? And then to the BET and then the RTM.
Right.
And my guess is there are going to be projects that will have an impact, right? It's the way of the world.
It's a zero-sum game,
to be perfect.
isn't it?
So what we need to do is have a standard process and protocol to address it.
Right.
And not be shy that we ran into a problem, but in some ways demonstrate that our process works and that we're successful because it was identified for whatever the reason is.
Right.
And now we're bringing it to the various boards to have a more deliberate conversation.
Very good. Can I ask my second question? It's okay. Thank you. I think it echoes what a lot of people have been saying. I would actually move, if possible, the asset management software piece up and maybe marry it with the project management piece, especially because I'd hate to buy one system and find out that, well, one system would work better, and one day you would probably have the asset management system would depreciate an asset and would flow into a project, right? So it'd be great if we could marry those two, and I'd hate to get down the road and say, oh, we picked the wrong project management system for the asset management system.
And I don't disagree, and it really has to do with resources.
Of course. Okay, thank you so much.
Dr. Francis.
So mine, I think goes back, I have to push, goes back a little bit. I think it's been touched on, but I feel like for me, this is kind of starting at about the 30% process, and we're missing the 0 to 30%. Which is a board member, we start thinking about a project, particularly the big capital, which I guess, wasn't really addressed, but we start thinking about a project and then we start sort of scoping it out, and then maybe a consultant comes and talks about it. But, really formalizing, because I'm like 3 years into this and I'm still like, okay, when do you go to planning and zoning, and when exactly does the MI process, and when does the building committee take over, and all of these things. Now, I've actually reached out to some people from the new leb, because I'm on policy, to say, can we start putting in paper how you guys made this work well? Because they're like, yeah, when we started doing this, we were working from scratch. I'm like, okay, this is not the first big project we've done. You shouldn't have felt like you were starting from scratch. So I don't know if this is somehow going to relate to this, or how we tie it in, or if it's something else we need to do. But I think there's a big need to look at that part of it as well.
And I don't disagree, but in my mind, it is part of this.
Okay.
So there's one of the templates that I put out there was a project initiation. Why are we doing this project, right? And it has nothing, it hasn't been approved. But what does this project look like? What are we trying? What are we trying to accomplish? What are some of the key deliverables? And that, in my mind, is part of the whole project management tasks and activities that need to be followed. So we're going to have a starting point that is at inception,
okay,
not where we're in construction. That's too late, to be honest with you.
Right, okay.
So it's really at the inception. And then we have these lists of task activities, deliverables that we need to complete that are tied to that project. And so it's part of the overall continuum. And we're not, I hear what you're saying, and I apologize if I presented that we're starting at 30%. We need to start at the 1% or 0%.
And would you expect that to include, like, when do we do ed specs and when do we go to planning and zoning? I mean, are you
Yes.
looking at those
Oh,
details
yeah,
also?
yeah.
Okay, great. Good,
Yeah.
I misunderstood. Okay.
Yeah, no, you have to incorporate it into the overall plan because you have to account from a timing perspective. Because if we have to go to P and Z, right, or was it ed spec or the?
Yeah, the ed specs.
Right,
Right.
so there's you know, it certainly takes a certain amount of time to go through planning and zoning, right? We need to account for that in the overall project schedule because that obviously could have an impact on when we start the project.
Mr. Scher.
I just want to clarify 2 points you made. Maybe this is also for the group. This is actually outlining, implementing, if I read it right, these recommendations are, these are standard practices that you should be implementing that you're not implementing right now.
Correct.
Right, I mean, from my world, I'm used to this. When you say all this stuff, this is like not magic.
No.
Everywhere else in the world does it like this, and there's a set of standards for this
Correct.
stuff. You could pull this stuff off a shelf and start implementing it here tomorrow if we so chose. It's not like we have to invent this
No.
to the town of Greenwich.
Correct.
Right? The second point, and so your recommendation is get on with getting your standard practices cleaned up in place.
Correct. And there's, I'm going to call it, there's an approval process. So
Sure,
I guess my
right.
point is that we need to do some work, I'm pointing to the folks over here, right? But we need to do some work here, and then it needs to be reviewed, you know, internally, brought to the BOE, maybe BET, just to keep them in the loop. You know what I'm saying?
Your scope was, as Dr. Francis was talking about, using PMI parlance, you're going from phase 0.
Correct.
You're going all the way at the beginning.
Correct.
Now, my second question is, as you can hear, there's this underlying debate here about departments in the town, who should do what. Right? I just want to be clear on your recommendation. Is your recommendation saying that because I think I heard you say you didn't, evaluated different departments in the town, hold on, let me just finish the question.
Sorry.
Different departments in the town and who would be best to execute this? Or you're saying this totally agnostic of that question? As an example, you said, well, the Board of Ed, we were obviously the people who commissioned this. So, but you're not, are you guys making that recommendation based upon an evaluation you've done, or just said, is it more fair to say, these are the practices you need to have in place? And Blum Shapiro is saying, somebody has to do them following these as best practice. You're not saying within the town of Greenwich who that ought to be right now, right?
Yeah, so just to be very clear, we did not have any detailed conversations with any town departments in any
Other
rate.
people who could execute.
Right, we and I can, in the report, we identified, you know, some folks, we've talked to, oh, sorry.
Saw that.
Yeah, so we talked to just.
That wasn't part of your scope.
No, it was just from, we were doing it just to understand the process. So when we actually spoke to the Director of Planning and Zoning, Katie DeLuca, right? We were trying to understand what and how things happen as it relates to, specifically to the school capital projects. We were not trying to ascertain what the town does. Now, through our discussion, I was asking, well, how does the town do it, right? So it was somewhat anecdotal, right? Excuse me. Having said that, I suspect, and it's my gut, I don't know anything more than that, that the town could take advantage of some of this as well. That's it.
But it would be overreach to say this recommendation says this group versus that group should be doing this.
Correct, correct. This is from the Board of Ed perspective only, period. But I like to look at things in teams.
Sure.
And that's why I brought it up for discussion. That's it.
Ms. Hess.
Hi, so I want to go back to the Mike Leslie discussion because I just want to make sure I understand something. So you're talking about, you know, doing capital now, running a parallel process where you try to get these processes and procedures in place. Maybe you supplement with a third party. So it's a two-part question. One, when you look at current capital, are you distinguishing between maintenance, scheduled maintenance, and master plan? Number one. And number two, if you run a parallel path where you haven't put your processes in place and you hire a third party, aren't you sort of perpetuating the problem a little? Like, don't you really need to make sure you've at least some of this in place before you bring a third party in? Because you want to make sure that they're doing things the way you want them to do it, and so you have the data you need.
You have used third-party vendors for a long while now, so this is not a change, if you will, in protocol, right? I had mentioned earlier that there was a gentleman that had been working with the facilities director as a third-party vendor, then you hired that individual. Although from a timing perspective, we'd love it to fit nice and neat and have all the standards and protocols put into place before we had that third-party vendor, I think it's probably impractical to make that happen, right? I just don't see how that is going to happen in the time frame that we're talking about, in the time of year that we're talking about. So I think what we can do, and working with the facilities director, is to provide we can put together some standard practices to get that moving forward and reach out to a third-party vendor that we're comfortable with, that will provide us with good a set of project management skills. But we can work in parallel. And that's what I'm suggesting, is that we work together in parallel so that as our policies and procedures are formalized, we will share that with the vendor so they will get on board.
Mr. Raymer.
So you were describing that the procedures we were using were a little weak in determining the completion of projects. I'm curious whether or not the review that Lindsay did was able to confirm in any of the projects whether or not there were elements of the projects, deliverables that were in fact part of the appropriation, but the work was not completed. The work described in the appropriation was not completed. Was that part of Lindsay's review in any way?
I can answer that.
Okay, I'll take answers from you too, Jeff. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
We did it together. There is no document that formalizes all the deliverables. So it's a very difficult process to answer. I guess what I'm saying is I can't answer your question because I don't have a list of the key deliverables. I can guess at the deliverables. Things looked reasonable when we did it, but I can't do a ticking and tying out because there's nothing to tick and tie out to.
Mr. Bernstein.
Well, if I could, I think I can answer your question, Jeff, or at least clarify it. I think what you're asking is if we said we were going to paint a classroom, did it get done, versus the financial closeout, which is we spent the money in the account, there's overage, we've returned it to the town, and there's a process for doing that. Those are two very different things. I've asked the question 10 times with Lori, which is why I know the answer. Right, he asked about the first one, so I don't know which one you were referring to. Did you look to see was the painting done?
Let me describe the question. I mean, surely the appropriation describes work, and even more surely the contract with the vendor requires certain work. So there's an opportunity for a comparison whether or not the work contracted for with the vendor fulfills all the elements of the work described in the appropriation. And then there's the second question of whether or not the work is closed out and not all the work in the vendor's contract was completed. I was curious whether or not you ever made at any point the determination that, yes, those deliverables were not delivered.
We could not make that determination.
That's a good answer. Thank you.
Based on the description of work in your vendor contract, which needs improvement, to be honest. They're pretty vague. You know, you got a 500-page vendor contract. The description of work often was a paragraph. That needs, you know, it doesn't have milestones in it or check the boxes. To follow up with that, there is no project closeout sheet where the director of facilities or the project manager said, yes, this vendor did everything we paid them to do as outlined in the contract, check the box complete. out in Munis. So we just guessed for reasonability and appropriateness based on what that paragraph in the contract said.
Thank you.
Mr. Turner.
I'm good, thank you.
Mr. Weisbrod.
So you made one comment that said I think I'm replaying it, you're concerned about the resources you have, I think you meaning the Board of Ed, I assume, and their ability to do it. So we have here a page with a timeline, and the only resource that it really points to is at the back end of the timeline, which is the project manager of 90 to 125,000. So it's nice to have the schedule, but if we're concerned, or you're concerned about the resources and the ability of the existing resources to do it, I mean, we probably should hear from the Board of Ed or from you as to, okay, what incremental resources and what cost would be associated with those incremental resources so that this timeline is realistic.
I think because of the resources you have, that's the reason that we spaced out these implementations. For example, you have Munis right now. Based on the 20 people we interviewed, nobody's really fully 95+% using Munis. So before you go out and implement an asset management system or a project management system, let's figure out how to use Munis first. Let's get them in now. Because you don't have a 30-person facilities department to do all this, that's sort of why this implementation plan is laid out that way. I think we tried to be, like Jeff said earlier, conservative because they have a day-to-day job that let's not bite off more than we can chew with this implementation.
Well, let me just make sure, let me ask it again to be really clear. Can you implement this within the time frame that you've identified with the existing resources, or can you not? That's the question.
Excuse me, David, do you mean with the existing staffing, or do you mean?
I think you're going to need some outside support. And I think I've been saying that
You have?
all along.
No, you're clear. You're extremely clear. What I'm trying to get a sense of is, because I think at some point we need to turn to the Board of Ed and say, okay, wonderful piece of work. You own it. You're the Board of Ed. It's your facility. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And if what you're saying is that they don't have the resources to do it or the ability to even do it with the existing resources, then before we even start talking about this, it would seem to me we have to be very clear about what are those resources, how long would it take to get them on stream, how much would that cost, and so forth.
And I want to be clear about one comment. I do not believe that the first step is to hire a project, to hire a person. I don't think that's the right course of action.
But if we don't have the resources to do it, then how do you do it?
We don't, but we might not have the resources today to do it, but based on technologies that we use, the project management tools, the asset management tools, and having some good standards and protocols in place, we may be able to, using a combination of our staff right now, as well as external resources, get us over that hump. And once we create those standards, we can then make a determination if we need to hire someone full-time, if it makes good sense. If we have the capital projects aligned in the future for us to take advantage of a full-time person.
Okay. Those were all the identified speakers. Does anyone, I'd like to give the superintendent and the chief operating officer an opportunity, facilitate if they want to address us, but I'd like to make sure that the board members have had their questions answered. Is there anyone else who would like, Dr. Francis?
I don't know if this is am I supposed to, question or not, but it seems to me, a scenario, and I'd love to hear some responses to this, is, get a summer person as a project manager, which we've done in the past to try and get the load off, get some consultants in to help us get these standards set. And then once we've gotten through those steps and hopefully gotten some new systems in place, then we make that long-term decision. But it seems to me those are the places to put our first money into get the standard set, and get someone to help us for the summer. And we've done the summer consultant in the past, so it's just do that again this summer, even though we have a new person, because we've got a lot of other work we're trying to do.
And don't forget, there's some backfill work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Right? We got some projects that are underway, that are still underway, and we got to get, and I'm suggesting we need to get those well documented to the best of our ability, and that is going to take a bit of time.
Yep.
Mr. Bernstein.
So obviously, we've identified a number of issues, including headcount. We have some program reviews going on. That's going to eat up some of the time of some of the folks here. We are going to be onboarding a new superintendent. So, you know, I understand all of these elements. I understand we can outsource pieces of it, including the implementation of this. I guess what I want to ask is, what's the perfect plan for the interim period, right? We continuing work from you. We're hiring a consultant to do some of that. You know, we know how to hire a project manager for the summer. If there's need for other people to help close out old projects, we can do that. But what is the path forward? I mean, because I'm looking here at it's a 2-year timeline. What do we do to speed this process? Because what I don't want to end up is a situation where we say, well, you guys are moving down the road on a capital plan. We're not ready for that yet. We need to keep moving, right? We don't want to stop the car, but we're rebuilding. So what is the fastest path forward?
Get an outside consultant, could be us, could be someone else, to help in the development of those policies, procedures, and protocols. That consultant would be driving it, developing all the appropriate documents. It would be being reviewed by the various groups and committees, and then, once that's in place, then that's the protocol, policies, procedures, and protocols that we follow. Everything after that is just natural byproducts, if you will. That's, if you want to start, and you want to start quickly, that's what you need to do.
Ms. Dayton.
The Board of Ed, I think, has been advocating in the most specific terms, the most specific way we know how, for additional resources. We've advocated with the BET, we've advocated with the RTM, various different committees. It takes a full year when we put in a proposal in a budget for it to be passed, and then an additional 6 months to hire someone. So this is a 2-year time frame. At what point would you think the Board of Ed might want to plan to ask for additional staff? After a year? Okay.
Mr. Drake.
This was excellent work. I thought it was very helpful. And, the 20 of us between the two boards set this in motion together. It was worth doing, and it's, the leadership of it was really Mr. Bernstein, Ms. Dayton, Ms. Hess, and Ms. Moriarty. I propose that we're all here groping for what's the next step, what's the action plan. I would leave the initiative for that in the hands of those four to continue. You've now got the work product from the outsiders that you requested. You can cogitate on it for a while, obviously. I'd propose that those four people develop the next steps and action plan. For my orientation, it's always easy to ask for outside resources. I need another consultant, I need another employee, maybe. But first, I have confidence in that group. The progress is good. Stay with it and develop this into the action plan that you see suitable. We trust your judgment.
Mr. Deuce. Okay, Mr. Turner.
I'd like to ask about the newly hired project manager in the very, very near term or short term. What is the envisioned role of that project manager? I don't know who that should go to, but we just hired someone. Obviously, we have needs that have been identified. You've got a recommendation. In the very short term, what's the role of the newly hired PM?
I'm assuming, and I will certainly let the facilities director comment as well, but I'm assuming that that individual is monitoring and tracking projects, current active projects.
we're fortunate enough.
You should take the microphone just so that it gets broadcast. Thank you.
We're fortunate enough to hire a gentleman who we had used as summer help, and when I came on board, he was the, I'm going to call him an interim project manager. It was through the company, company's name is Cloud Organization or something like that. Eric knows the district, he knows the buildings, he knows our on-call A&E firms. He was a logical fit. I can talk about dollars that were allocated towards this position that were kind of lowered when we had to go through the process with the town. That's another discussion we should have. His role will be as a project manager. He will oversee everything from the design through the closeout. He will assist me on future budget creations. He has an active role in reporting to me. He has an active role in the change management on the job. Right now, he's in the process of overseeing some of the projects that weren't completed last summer that are being completed at night. For instance, the North Mianus HVAC project. He's overseeing some work that can be done during school hours in mechanical spaces. He's assisted me on the projects, the emergency projects, and he will take a very active role in project management this summer.
Okay, good, thank you.
And as far as a second project manager, we are interviewing this week to fill Eric's previous position. We can call it summer help, but it's going to extend much longer than that.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I know you have your hand up, but I believe P&Z may have this room at 7:30. I'm not sure, and I did want to give Mr. Mayo a chance to speak if he.
We need to, just from the Board of Ed perspective, Peter, this is one for you. This is effectively, everything that's here is management. It's all management recommendations. So in our board, this is, in my view, maybe the other 7 board members will have a view on this, leaving out the BET. These are all these are things that these guys need to execute. It's not something for the Board of Ed itself to take up. Our role in this thing, this is great information. This is like a monitoring report. But in terms of action by our board, the only action we need to take is if they need resources, money, if they need money approved to do this. But I think for our board, there's nothing really for us to do, because in the CEO model, unless they are asking specifically for us to endorse this, they should just go do this.
So I don't know that I disagree with you, and obviously we can talk as a board. I think even if we do move forward with that as the premise, we would want regular updates and monitoring. So I think maybe Ralph, if you want to have an opportunity, and Lori, I don't know if you do as well. Thank you.
You know, I think when I walked into the office on July 1st, actually it wasn't July 1st, it was July 15th, the first thing that Lori said to me was that we didn't have a lot of systems in place to manage our capital processes. I mean, she said other words, but her big message to me was that we needed to get systems in place to make sure that we're not wasting any resources or any money from the taxpayer. So I think that, you know, what Jeff has done here has given us a nice roadmap to get where Lori wanted to take us back before we even started talking about that roof at Julian Curtis, that debacle. So I think we're ready to move forward, and we're looking forward for your support.
Thank you. Ms. O'Donnell, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Sit.
Okay, great, thanks. I just want to be clear because I kind of hear that there have been sort of like a number of questions about what resources do we need. In my mind, and having reviewed the full report, the resources that I'm pretty certain we need is a consultant to help us implement the process. So starting from that step 0, all the way through project closeout, helping us put all those templates in place, all those processes into place, helping us actually document, what those procedures are for capital budgeting will be huge. And not just for us. I mean, we obviously have a long way to come, but for the future, every time there is a transition, that this document is essential to helping that continuity move forward. So we're committed to that. We do need to hire a consultant, and I don't know how long it would take. I would hope it would take somewhere within the 3-month time range. I would like to get started immediately. But the other challenge that we have is the only administrator supporting the director of facilities and now the new project manager is a technical assistant who is also supporting the phone system. And just so we're clear on what that role is, it's literally taking phone calls on a regular basis saying, I want to move my phone line from here to there, or I need to reset a voicemail, and this is very time consuming and taking her away, district-wide, taking her away from focusing on the financial and managerial or administrative support that we need in-house. So if you think about what resources we truly have for facilities, it's the director of facilities who's overseeing the capital projects as well as the maintenance, regular operations, so the custodial staff, the mechanics, the day-to-day, right, the operating stuff. And then we also have now the project manager, thankfully, and then basically like a half-time administrator. And yet we have so many reporting requirements that really have to happen, and certainly these procedures that we'll put into place and all of the standards that come along with it will require more administrative support. So that is truly what I think our next step is. I would love to get started tomorrow, or as quickly as we can. Obviously, we have to go through all the proper steps. But I just want to be clear that that's really what we're looking at. And provided we could figure out how to get those resources, we will implement right away. I'm really excited to be able to get us to where we need to be.
Thank you. It seems like there are a number of people who have more to say. I'd like to find out whether, is there someone else in this room at 7:30? Do you know? 8 o'clock. Oh, so we have a little bit of time. Okay. Ms. Hess.
Lori, thank you. So, sorry. When you said that you'd have to go through the process and it would take 3 months to get a consultant, I guess my question is, don't you have a state contractor list, which Bloom Shapiro is part of? And I guess the question is, do you need to really go through all of that? Or could you literally just, I don't know, it looks like you need up to $25,000 to kind of start this process. Could you start immediately if it's a state-approved contractor and not wait 3 months?
I'm sorry. Yeah, to clarify, first of all, Bloom Shapiro is on state contract. And I meant that it would take us 3 months to implement, not that it would take us 3 months to get somebody on board.
I guess I'd point out we'd also have to find $25,000.
Mr. Turner.
Yes, and Chairman Bernstein raised a great question, which is, or a great point, which is what I want to ask about. Mechanically, where do we go from here? Obviously, there's a financial request. Are we going to be looking for the Board of Education for an amended? I'll stop there. What are the, maybe that's a Chairman Moriarty question, I'm not sure.
Ready?
I think, as Ms. Moriarty pointed out before, we are in the midst of our budget process, so if there are additional requests for the fiscal 20 budget, then the BET would need to receive it as soon as possible, and that could be through further discussion. This has been a partnership, and I think the best words that I heard you say was setting up for success, which is in the interest of all the town residents, and we represent all of the town residents here. So I think there probably requires additional dialogue. Some of it may need to be initiated by the Board of Education or the Public Schools Administration. Some of it may be something that we could talk about in finance as well, but that needs to be discussed. Mr. Mason?
I remember earlier in the program that you had mentioned the townwide also is really not too many steps ahead. So why would we not want to have this training and implementation be done on a standard basis for the whole town? Instead of, and then that would beg a question of, from a financing point of view, might not have anything to do with the Board of Ed. That might be a different conversation. But if we're going to work towards consistency, then why do we put the Board of Ed through this boot camp when we can put?
We're not carving out silos here, right? That's why we're working together, is not to carve out silos. It's to come up with a solution that's going to work for all of the residents as well as the employees. Mr. Bernstein.
And just to point out, right, the first step is the one that we want to get done the fastest, the procedures. But following on that is the software. We may want to look at putting money in the budget for next year for software. But the $25,000 to get this kicked off, that's got to happen sooner than later.
Ms. Moriarty.
Just to refer to the recommendation, there are a series of, you said this has been implemented in lots of different places. There's the PMI Institute, PMI, to really refer to, we're not creating something new. So it'd be, I think, helpful to understand the scope of really what we really need. I don't know whether it all has to be outsourced. I think there has to be ownership for some of the documents, and there's some things that are already going to be presented that way. Clearly, we want this done, and we want this done well, but there may be alternatives in how we approach it.
Dr. Francis.
Two quick things for us to think about. One, I think, is interim versus waiting. So if it's for the consultant, if we decide that's what we want to do, is that an interim? I think if we're talking about the software, chances are we're probably not going to be ready for that until the budget, but we might want to think about putting it in for this year. The other thing I was going to say, just in response, Peter, I do think one piece of it, sort of thinking from the policy perspective, when we're looking at starting at initial thought in terms of projects, I think that should be part of our policies. And I think we do want that to be in policies and regulations. So I don't think that's just an administrative issue. I think that is a Board of Ed functioning issue, and that it should be there.
Peter, do you want to have the last word? It's very rare that I offer that up. Actually, I might rescind that offer.
No, I appreciate everybody's comments. A lot of hard work has gone into this, and obviously this is just the jumping off point for the real labor, which is going to fall on the folks sitting on the side of the room. So I appreciate the openness and the willingness. I don't think this is the last time any of us are going to discuss this topic. So I look forward to continued discussion as we move down the road.
Mr. Ziplo actually asked for the last word.
All right.
So there was a question that was asked earlier about, how many other municipalities use the org, right? So I'm going to use that as a spearhead for my last comment of the night, which is the real question here is how many other municipalities, communities, get both the Board of Ed and the BET in a room to have a lively discussion, but a constructive discussion. You all participated in something that is very unique for many municipalities. So I just want to share that with you. Great things can happen when groups of people come together and constructively look to be successful for the entire community and not look at things as islands or us versus them. So I will leave you with, you guys did an awesome job tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Deuce, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I've been waiting for this all night. It would be adjourned.
Is there a second?
I second. She's our usual.